Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Sudhir Pandey, and I welcome you to Ahmedabad University and to the conversation series. Today, we have a very different panel, and the topic is something which everybody would like to discuss and to know more on this. You have been getting views on this topic from different perspectives, but today we have a very reasonable voice in this area, Professor Mekhala Krishnamurthy, and in with her, Professor Karthik Rao-Cavale will be in conversation. There are certain rules. Most of you know this because I can see most of you who are joining from the previous webinar as well. But I request you to rename yourself if you have not renamed yourself, so that when you put your questions, we get to know who is asking. And as you know that we take all the questions at the end, and both the speakers will address all the questions. During the conversation, everybody will be muted except the both the speakers, and the conversation will go for 50, 60 minutes. And then after that, we'll take all the questions and answers. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Mekhala Krishnamurthy. She's an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at Ashoka University. She is currently a non-resident visiting scholar at Center for Advanced Studies at UPenn, and she has been trained at Harvard University, University of Cambridge, University College London, where she completed her PhD in anthropology as a UCL Global Excellence Scholar. For the last 15 years, Professor Mekhala's research, publications, policy, and professional engagements have involved work within and across a range of field sites and subjects, including women's court and dispute resolution, community health workers and public health systems, agriculture and agricultural markets, and water. Her current project explores the changing social, economic, and political lives and relationships of an agriculture market mandi in the central Indian state of Madhya Pradesh. We are thrilled to have you, Professor Mekhala. Welcome to Ahmedabad University.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. Yeah, in with Mekhala in conversation, we have Professor Karthik Rao-Cavale. He's an assistant professor in the Division of Social Sciences at School of Arts and Sciences, Ahmedabad University. He received his doctoral training from the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT and has obtained prior degrees from Rutgers and IIT Madras. His research interests lie in regional political economy, historical geography, and economic development. He's currently working on a social history of regional road networks, regimes and circulation, and rural development in southern India. So I welcome you, Karthik, and thank you so much for doing this to both of you. And I request you to begin the conversation.
Thank you, Sudhir, and thank you, Mekhala, very much. Obviously, the farmers' protests are on the top of our minds these days. They've been occupying the news, and you have been at the forefront of a lot of clarifying issues to a wider audience, getting people to understand what is at stake, and really sort of bringing some very rich perspectives to a conversation that has at some level been not really focusing on the issues. Right, this tendency in our media to distract, to focus on things that are not important, and you have been sort of helping us bring the conversation back to what it should be really about. And that really is reflected in the abstract, where you say, well, we've focused at some often a little bit too much on the business of agriculture and not the people who do the business of agriculture. And perhaps that shift in focus is necessary and urgent. And so I really look forward to this conversation. And I know that I will learn a lot from it, and I hope the audience will learn a lot as well. So if you don't mind, I'd like to start with some very basic and clarificatory question, right? So these farmers' protests that we have been reading and watching so much about, they are about 3 bills that were passed in Parliament recently. But these bills are themselves either amendments or modifications to legislations that have been around for a longer time. So could you give us a sense of what is this legislative landscape within which these three interventions have come about. Right? What is the broader regulatory landscape for agricultural marketing in India?
So thanks so much, Patrick. Thank you all for spending your Saturday afternoon in this conversation with us. It's a real pleasure to be at Ahmedabad University, whether it's virtually, albeit still really, just wonderful for me. And wonderful, Karthik, to have an opportunity to actually discuss with you because, political economy is at the heart of this question. And how do we study political economy and understand it in all its diversity and complexity? So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So let me take your question first. And you're absolutely right. I mean, these are described as central new laws and, they were also presented as, in a sense, historic legislations. And they are in a number of different senses, actually quite unprecedented and historic. But you're absolutely right in saying that they have a history and a prehistory, which we need to understand. And actually, looking at each of them helps us think about that in an interesting way, because it takes us back to, both continuities and departures between colonial, post-colonial India and what has happened over the last 20 years in post-liberalization India, and then what is happening, today. So let me try and do this as briefly as possible. So as you said, there were three acts. They were introduced first as ordinances. That in itself is rather interesting and unprecedented, to have major reforms in the structure and functioning of agricultural markets initially introduced as ordinances. And then, as we all know, there was a very controversial parliamentary session in which they were passed in September, and then they came into being central laws. One of them is an amendment to Essential Act, which is the Essential Commodities Act. Again, both of them, actually all three of the laws together, but certainly the FPTC, so the Farmers Trade and Promotion and Trade Facilitation Act, and the Essential Commodities Amendment Act have an old history. And what is interesting about this history is that one of them focus on consumers and the others focus on producers. So one is the classical consumerist legislation, and that is actually the Essential Commodities Act. And you remember, it was actually, the original act was 1955, but it has a colonial history as well, which had to do with the regulation of the trade and circulation and distribution of agricultural commodities, particularly of essential commodities. And it came out of a context of not just scarcity and dearth, but also famine. Where there was a sense that in a very, very large poor population, traders, particularly those who control the circulation of essential goods and commodities, could have disproportionate market power that could make people very, very vulnerable when it comes to the essentials of survival. So basically food was very critical there, but cotton and other things, clothing, have always been part of this system as well. And so this is the context within which essential commodities regulation was there. And Rohit Day has written about this historically. It was not like the decision to continue to have an Essential Commodities Act in post-colonial India was uncontested. There was a sense that these controls and regulatory controls and protections could become highly restrictive and lead to themselves a whole range of malpractices. And so this wasn't without contestation that we had such laws. But both these acts and the original sort of regulation of agricultural commodities comes from a deep suspicion in colonial and post-colonial India of traders, of the intermediary classes, of mercantile capital, of the middlemen, right? So the first was about protecting consumers from hoarding in times of scarcity. And the other, which is Agricultural Produce Market Acts, which were also introduced around the same time in the 1950s. The oldest of these acts, for example, in Odisha, came in the 1950s, but they sort of unfolded from the 60s and 70s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Was producerist legislation. Now, this was about protecting Indian producers. On the other hand, we had a very vast population of very small producers from mercantile capital, again, from traders and money lenders. And the idea was that they needed regulated markets where they could go and sell their produce. The big difference between the Essential Commodities Act and these agricultural produce marketing acts is that constitutionally, the Essential Commodities Act was always a central act, and the agricultural produce marketing acts have been, both during colonial rule and in post-colonial India, state acts. And this sort of comes from the understanding that agricultural markets, like agriculture, because agricultural markets are so critically tied up with agricultural production systems, are state subjects. So their prehistory actually dates back to, in 1897, we had, there was the Bihar Cotton and Grain Market Acts, then the Bombay Cotton Market Act in 1927, the Royal Commission on Agriculture in 1928 talked about the need to have regulated markets, and then of course we had these agricultural produce marketing acts in independent India. Now the logic there was very simple, that you have small producers, and in any given regional context, you will have many producers and a small number of buyers, right? This is so that these markets are what you would call, have a tendency to natural monopolies, right? Small number of buyers in any given area and a very large number of sellers. And in this context, market power will always adhere more likely to the buyers, who are more powerful, have more credit, and are enmeshed with ongoing market systems, rather than the sellers. And so the idea was that we needed what they called in the 1928 Royal Commission properly regulated markets, which were physical marketplaces, which were publicly regulated, where farmers could go, and essentially they would ensure three things. They would ensure proper price discovery, ideally through auctions and some kind of transparent system. They would allow the standardizations of weights and measures. So, M.L. Dantwala in his Marketing of Raw Cotton, very famous and important book, talks a lot about, the ways in which weights and measures, and weight is one of the great evils that farmers have to confront. So you had to have a, standardization of weights and measures. And the third was payment, the immediate and timely and full settlement of payment. Because you can all imagine that for farmers, there's quite a big difference from the price that is discovered and the price you take home in your pocket. After all commissions are deducted and all discounts are made, etc. So the third thing was to ensure full and complete settlement of payment. And because these are physical markets, and because they are agricultural markets having to do with, a range of different kinds of actors with different statuses, social power, economic power, you needed a credible dispute resolution mechanism, which was to be done through a market committee, which would have adequate representation of farmers from the local area, as well as a traders representative, a representative of the laborers, a government representative as well. And this market committee would ensure that there are adequate dispute resolution mechanisms on the ground. And this was seen as a basic set of protections that, all farmers should have. And at independence, we had about 40, I think it's somewhere between 40 and 50 actually regulated markets, properly regulated markets. And that number has increased over the years. So by latest accounts, we have around 6,500 to 7,000 such markets, APMC, Agricultural Produce Marketing Committees, under different state acts across the country. And of these markets, about 2,500 of them are actually, sort of what we would call principal markets, and the others are sub-market yards. So this was the logic and the vision, right? One side to protect consumers, the other to protect producers, an overall suspicion that market power, especially in the hands of small traders and mid-sized traders, would favor buyers over sellers, or, in this case, favor sellers over buyers in the case of consumption. And this was the vision. So there was definitely a moral vision behind them. And just one last point to make, that, there are other laws that have always governed markets. So certain commodities like cotton, for example, sugar, have commodity specific acts tobacco has had as well. So there are commodity specific acts. And there's also a long and contested history around futures markets regulation and speculation, which was banned in India in the 1960s and then reintroduced in the mid 2000s. Now we have NCDX and all the electronic commodity exchanges. But for the better part of independent India, we actually banned speculation and futures trading. So that's another regulatory system, and they're all come under different regulatory authorities, state, center, and other kinds of regulatory institutions. And that's not to mention informal regulation, which we'll take on later.
Now, I mean, I want to turn at this stage to your own work, which is fascinating. So for your dissertation and after, I understand you work in a small town called Harda in Madhya Pradesh. Could you tell us what drew you to this, to the study of a mandi? Like why did you choose to study a mandi? What were some of the questions you went to the field with? Right? What were you thinking of asking at that time? And also sort of a sense of what you understood about the lived reality of these market sites.
Yeah, so I mean, it's always good to give a little bit of context. So from 2003 till about 2007, I started my PhD in 2007. I was actually working in the social initiatives group at ICICI Bank, and I was working on public health. And it was a very interesting time because at that time, particularly, there was a lot of talk about corporate-led rural transformation. It was not only a time when microfinance was happening, corporates were getting into that, the whole banking transformation around rural India. But it was also a lot of talk. ITC had launched eChopal. There was a lot of discussion. A lot of big retail majors. Reliance was getting on the ground with retail, and, looking at agriculture in a big way. Many major Indian corporations and multinational corporations were making their way to rural India in a way that sounded unprecedented and new. Of course, Indian corporates have had a very, very long history in agricultural markets. If you talk to traders, the original corporation they will all talk to you about is the East India Company. So they have a particular idea of what corporate engagement in India has been. But so it was very interesting to me to try and understand what was going on. How were corporations thinking about mapping rural India? What was this corporate-led agricultural transformation going to look like? People were at that time already talking about a second green revolution that was to be led by the private sector rather than by the government. Something that actually almost prefigures what we're hearing with these laws as well. So this was, on my mind. And so when I went to the field, it was actually to understand what was going on. And Madhya Pradesh was a state where, of course, ITC had begun its work, and there were these case studies that were coming up. And there's a sense that something interesting is happening. So I got on the ground to try and trace corporate engagement. And what I found in the first few weeks and months of doing this was that it was a lot of one step forward, two step back. A lot of things were being said, but there was not a lot on the ground. And it was very discursive. People were talking a lot about mapping the rural and taking, but when you got on the ground, you didn't see all that much. In terms, you would see warehouses come up and there would be a chopal, but this wasn't where most people seemed to be buying or selling or even aware of what was happening. And I would keep finding my way back to the central institution that seemed at the heart of agrarian exchange in the parts of Madhya Pradesh that are sort of between Indore and Bhopal, where I mandi hopped and I would stop in each small town about 25 kilometers in and try and understand what was happening. And you would always come back to the mandi. And this struck me that there was something that if I had studied corporate expansion at that time, I may be studying discourse more than practice. I may have ended up saying they're saying one thing and doing something else, which is an incredibly boring thing to find out and say, because as all anthropologists know, everybody says something and does something else, and that's got nothing to do with any kind of hypocrisy. That's just how the world works. And I didn't want to say that. And so I decided to base myself in a mandi, which seemed like a very interesting site because it was an old site. It was one where you could actually look at transformations over a period of time. I saw all actors there, including corporate actors. Most corporations in Madhya Pradesh and in the soybean markets were all buying from mandis. So processors, regional processors, ITC traders, everybody used to engage in the mandi. So you saw a whole range of different actors, large and small buyers engaging there. I saw a very large, diverse range of farmers coming into the mandi as well. So for me, that was interesting. The second thing that was very interesting about the mandi was that unlike a village, which is also very dynamic, and Clifford Geertz always said anthropologists don't study villages, they study in villages. Yeah, you always study more than villages, but you study in a village. The mandi was a very interesting site because it was a site of intimacy. It was small enough that I could fit into the rhythms of the mandi, spend day after day after day in the mandi, as a good anthropologist should. But it was also a site of interconnection, where I could see the relationships play out between farmers and traders, between traders and the state, between farmers and the state, between labor and all these groups, farmers, traders, and the state, between corporate capital and regional capital. And I could also study the relationships between futures exchanges and spot markets. And so as a site, it actually gave me an opportunity to study interconnections. As much as it gave me an opportunity to study very intimately relationships and transitions over time. I used to joke that at the time that I decided to study mandis, they were definitely not fashionable. There were probably more mall ethnographies than mandi ethnographies, as there still are today in India. And then I discovered later that, in a conversation that B.S. Bhaviskar had very early in the 1960s with M.N. Srinivas, M.N. Srinivas had said, you've come into sociology from economics. Would you like to study Hapur Mandi, very famous mandi close to Delhi? And, Bhaviskar had said to him that, my heart is set on studying the sugarcane cooperatives. And he recounts that Srinivas had then told him that, it's important to go where your heart tells you to go. But for me, in some ways, Harda is not Hapur, but it is a completion of one of those projects on M.N. Srinivas's list, I think, where he had put down that a mandi should be studied like this. And what it's turned out to be is a sort of 150-year history where I trace transformations in Harda mandi and the relationships between these different groups over time. And it's been my great privilege after that to have a chance to study agricultural markets in Karnataka, in Bihar, in Odisha, and Punjab, which has really brought out to me the enormous diversity of these markets. But yeah, Harda is really where I immersed myself in the life and times and full drama of India's agricultural markets and our mandis.
Okay, if you want to begin with your presentation now, the one that you said you'd be sharing, because unfortunately Karthik logged out. There was some problem.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, actually there wasn't a presentation. The point that I think I'll make here is that, one of the things about when you study a mandi, and it's important from the point of view of regulation, in that period, in 2004, 5, to 2008, 9, the villain of agricultural markets was this APMC, right? Everybody I met was talking about APMCs and the corruption involved with APMCs and the fact that they existed everywhere. Harda was the place I learned about the history of regulation and how it actually works in practice. So I think one of the things that is extraordinary, and here I follow a number of scholars, and particularly in the most persistent scholar of Indian agricultural markets, of course, is Barbara Harris-White, who has studied them over 50 years. And she studied agricultural markets in South India. First, she started with Tamil Nadu and different regions of Tamil Nadu. So she's followed markets, say, in the small town of Arni, but in Coimbatore to begin with. And then a number of us in more recent times, in the last 20 years, have also studied these markets in different places. And I think what is common here, and Harris-White's work showed this right at the offset, that Indian agricultural markets, because of the nature of agriculture as a state subject, And because of the extraordinary diversity in structures of production and exchange, marketing, processing, and distribution and consumption across diverse states and sites, is exemplified and characterized by extraordinary diversity, complexity, and dynamism. And when you spend any amount of time in a specific market site, what you see is this diversity, complexity, and dynamism work itself out. Hi, Karthik.
I'm really
Sudhir
sorry.
asked me to move on. So I was just picking up on this point about institutional diversity.
Right. So I mean, the question that I was going to ask, which I think you anticipated, was the fact that there's so many different arrangements that we find. Did you mention the comparison with Bihar?
Yeah.
Yes.
No, so I hadn't. So I was just beginning to sort of say that, you know, building on Barbara Harris White's work, and of course Barbara spent, you know, 50 years in almost like a lonely pursuit, tilling this land of agricultural markets and really trying to illuminate its diversity and complexity. At Ashoka, we're really excited because in 2019, to mark 50 years of her first arrival in India during the Green Revolution, she gave us her archive, her markets archive. You know, so we have all, so for those of you who want to study agricultural markets and look at how it's been studied over years, we have all her markets archive material in the Ashoka archives for contemporary India. And it was really exciting. So building on her work, you know, one of the things I think we've all learned, and there are a number of scholars, you know, who I now am in the company of all of us who've been breaking our heads in different markets in different places. You know, empirical specification is like a general condition of studying agricultural markets because of how diverse and complex they are. And regulation is only one part of that diversity. So, I mean, even to just give you an example from Harda itself, Harda district has 3 mandis. Or in Harda district, both, you know, Harda block and Timarni are canal irrigated. Khirkia block is the dry block, right? Even between the 3 of these blocks, there is quite a lot of diversity in how markets are organized, in what is produced, in what is brought to the market, and the relative power of different actors, right? So that you see that. Harda Mandi was actually officially, you know, notified in 1969, but the first committee only came in 1972. And if you look at the 50 years of its existence, 25 years, that committee has been in suspension. It has either been dissolved, it was dissolved first during the emergency, and then at various times in the 1990s for 10 years, Mandi committees were dissolved. So, you know, the state has played a very active role in how mandis operate, but what you saw on the ground was very different from the idea of a villainous APMC that was consistently there. So what you saw is then waves of regulation came and went, different kinds of powers came and went. The state waned, mercantile power rose. There was a big change in power dynamics after canal irrigation came, and the mandi and its control shifted from, you know, a cotton trader who was part of the Congress party to a soybean jat farmer who was from the BJP, who became the MLA. So the mandi was a site of a lot of internecine political and other kinds of struggles. And major changes also happened in mandi regulation, but they were by no means the primary driver of market structure. And the reason for that is that Indian markets, you know, really sit within a very complex agricultural system, and they reflect the complexity of that system. So when you go on the ground, you see that production, exchange, processing, distribution, consumption are all deeply interrelated, right? And at the farm level, it's absolutely obvious. So a farmer produces crop. After the harvest, he retains or she retains a certain proportion of the harvest for home consumption, depending on what, you know, they're growing. They also keep a certain proportion as seed, right? The same crop that is kept for consumption is also seed. So is seed an input or is it an output, right? Is it something that you consume, and you are the same farmer is doing all 3 things, right? They are both selling something, also consuming it, and also using it in the next season as an input. So as soon as you go on the ground, you see how all of this interrelates. And then as you go a little further, you'll see soybean markets are completely different in their structuring than wheat markets, right? Wheat markets, after government procurement came in Madhya Pradesh in 2008, again changed their character quite remarkably and changed considerably. So I was just going to show very quickly, a set of images. I'll just take a couple of minutes to show you, what, like this is from our recent work that I did with Shumitur Chatterjee, Devesh Kapoor, and Marshall Bhuton, and this amazing group of RAs, research associates, who spent 14 of them who spent a year in 7 districts across Bihar, Orissa, and Punjab. But if you look at this is just one commodity, paddy, right? This is paddy in Bihar. This is what the network looks like. This is paddy in Balasore in Orissa, right? Where there is some, as you can see, there's also some procurement. There's more procurement than there is in Bihar. But, there's also a lot of parallel channels. This is Hoshiarpur, a very consolidated channel where virtually all the paddy that is produced, definitely non-basmati paddy, goes to the state. And it's a universal procurement system. And so, the site of sale is the mandi, whereas in both of these, the primary site of sale is overwhelmingly the village. But even within 2 different districts, this is Koraput district, and this is Sambalpur district, where you have much more procurement in Sambalpur than you have in Koraput. You can see the diversity of the supply chain just for paddy, right? So now if you introduce supply chains across different commodities, particularly processed commodities like oil seeds or pulses, versus perishable commodities, if you have cash crops versus largely food grain commodities, you will see vast differences. And you also see differences in the amount of marketable surplus, depending on what a commodity is used for. So in Dadri, right outside Shivnadar University, where I used to teach, and I spent some time in the mandi there, wage payments in wheat season used to happen in wheat. Wage payments in the paddy season happened in cash, because paddy was not consumed, rice was not eaten in this place, it was wheat. And so the food crop, actually the payments to labor still happened in grain. So, you see all of this kind of thing: market exchange, non-market exchange, material exchange. You see the coexistence of subsistence agriculture, agriculture for production and own consumption. You see, cash cropping. And this is all happening in common systems. This is something Shahid Amin pointed out in studying sugar and sugarcane in Gorakhpur, that Indian farmers are multi-cropping farmers, and they belong to a very complex system of production. So you see extraordinary diversity. And the point to mention here is that regulation is only one part of the story, right? Because of course, Odisha has regulated mandis, but trade happens outside. Punjab has regulated mandis, and almost all commodities go to the mandi. Certainly wheat and paddy go exclusively to the mandi, and that is because they're also procurement centers, where the mandi doesn't function so much as a market site, but as a procurement site for the state. And Bihar has no formal APMC markets, but it has there's informally regulated mandis, former bazaar samitis, and the old sites still exist. So there's a legacy and leftover from a previous generation. So this is what you see on the ground, right? I'll stop.
One question that really follows from all of this, right? You said when I asked you about the history of some of these legislations, you said that they were driven by a deep suspicion of the intermediate, right? Yeah. Now, in all of these diverse institutional arrangements that we see, from Tamil Nadu to West Bengal to Orissa and so on, the intermediary, the density of intermediation is different. There is also whether the extent to which they're institutionalized, right, or informal, but the there is a general role that these intermediaries play. They're not there without a reason. Would that be fair to say that intermediation is not going to go away, no matter what kind of regulation we think of and propose and implement?
Yeah, so I think that's really important. I think the primary learning that we've seen from across these very diverse sites is that markets in India are remarkably well adapted to the conditions of production and consumption, right? And not just the conditions of production. Right? We, of course, quite rightly focus a lot of our attention on farmers. And, it's interesting because the farm laws have talked a lot about freedom to farmers, or the debates around farm laws have talked about freedom. But for example, farmers don't usually start with freedom. They start with majburi, right? So what are your constraints? So for example, in order for you to have something to sell, you need to actually have generated surplus, which means that you need to have not suffered undue production risks at the time. Then in order for you to hold your produce and sell whenever you want, you need to either have credit or adequate cash, right? You also need to have adequate storage facilities, and your crop has to be the kind of crop that can be stored given the resources that you have for storing. So that would be a difference between even food grains and pulses have different storage capacities, let alone perishables, semi-perishables, and then crops that can be better stored. And then every decision you make has trade-offs. You may lose weight, you may gain weight, you may suffer other kinds of damage, etc. Then you have to have the site to sell at. Right? Most farmers that we look at in many of the smaller states, we looked at the small farmers, don't have mandis. And one of the things that is really important about what has happened over the last 70 years is that although the discourse says that Indian farmers are tied to selling in mandis, the truth is, for a vast majority of small and marginal farmers in this country, they don't have access to a mandi. Recently, I was in Agra district. This is, again, a very diverse cropping area. And the mandi there, the mandi yard, had been notified in 1980. In 2016, a border wall and a foundation stone was put. Today, that yard is used by the youth of this area to do their exercise and to do races. The mandi never came. The mandi is market is run outside. The mandi still collects taxes, actually. It collects fees. And so that is collecting, but it's not providing a service. And both farmers and traders said what they wanted was a vyavasthit, a well-appointed physical yard where they could actually go and exchange their commodities and have a proper, well-set-up system. And after these acts, one of their thoughts is that mandi will now never come. Right. So the truth is we never built enough mandis in most states, even in Madhya Pradesh, where actually they have not only a good network of mandis in Western Madhya Pradesh, but have actually pioneered some of the most interesting reforms. Same you'll see in Karnataka. If you go to the remote districts, if you go east of Jabalpur, you will stop seeing A-class mandis because surpluses shrink. The appointment of mandis are smaller. You'll see, much less government investment in either production or in consumption. So these are markets that are deeply sort of tuned to the conditions of production and, like I said, the conditions of consumption as well. So for example, in vegetable markets, intermediaries like artyas, they're called, play a very important dual role. They don't just provide credit to farmers. They also provide credit critically to the small buyers, right? Because these are mandis which have a lot of small vendors who then take and distribute across the city, sometimes in villages or in small towns. They also go from heart to heart, over across the week. Now, those people can't pay till they have sold. So they depend on the gadedar or the commission agent to finance them as well, right? So, so that's another really important function that they play. So even if the farmer didn't need credit, the onward buyer needs credit, right? So they play that function. Often they play the function of aggregation, of transport, sometimes of storage, And all of this, and most of the time they play multiple functions, and their margins, depending on the state and the commodity, aren't huge either. So we found, for example, in Bihar, very similar backgrounds. They had a slightly higher asset base, in the sense that the land was a little larger and they were a little richer. But for example, from paddy or maize, two of the main crops in these regions, intermediaries were making around 50 to 52,000 rupees per season, right? And that we only counted their costs as transport. So we haven't even added other kinds of costs that may have been included. So you're not seeing huge margins. So what you see are very efficient, but heavily intermediated markets, very diverse. So in each of these cases, and dynamic. So if an intermediary has an opportunity to exploit a buyer or a seller, they will take it. There's lots of hidden margins, whether those margins are in mixing of grain or in weights and measures or in other things. They're small, but important. Market power can definitely be exploited, but what you don't see are huge margins, except in some commodities, like in onion, there, competition of commission report also showed that there is some cartelization in some commodities. And in certain times of the year, you definitely see cartels begin to operate. We saw this with the chili syndicate in both Balasore and, a very strong group of intermediaries in the red chili markets in Sambalpur, where farmers had been actually asking the state to set up a mandi because they are so deeply exploited and don't have options. And they wanted a well-regulated mandi, but the state wasn't able to, provide it at the time. Now it has been brought inside a mandi yard, but trade is still happening outside. So, in all of these different contexts, market power is certainly there. But the big puzzle has been that, and again, Barbara Harris-White, others have pointed this out, that these markets are efficient. Right? Amy Cohen, who talked to a lot of the new companies who have entered India's markets in the last 15 years, she worked a lot in Karnataka and Bengal. They said the problem is these markets are hyper efficient. Right? It doesn't make sense for corporations to go all the way to the field. And most companies continue to buy from intermediaries or from larger wholesalers, and distributors in the system, rather than set up farm gate procurement systems, because it's actually the costs are quite high, the transaction costs are high, the cost of actually functioning with these kinds of rotations is really complicated. There are huge problems with distance, with aggregation, and so what you see is the market structure is responsive and adaptive to the conditions of production and consumption and processing. Regulation then comes in and further shapes the dynamic, right? And sometimes regulation shapes the dynamic in a way that helps farmers. At other times, it shapes dynamics in a way that allows for local and regional traders to dominate a particular scene. And sometimes all it does is create a shadow market, right? This is the formal mandi, but everything happens outside, and the mandi simply extorts you or takes a fee. Like in the case I was telling you, it takes a fee, but it doesn't provide you any services at all. We have all of these things, and we have a number of states like Kerala which never set up APMCs because they had plantation crops, and they actually functioned through commodity boards. So they didn't feel the need at that time to set up APMC markets and do it that way. We have Bihar and states which have repealed their acts completely. Much of the Northeast never set up their acts or implemented them. Bengal is a state which has APMCs, but a lot of trade happens outside, and APMCs are not set up for farmers. And then you have Maharashtra, Karnataka, Telangana, Andhra, Madhya Pradesh, parts of Chhattisgarh, where you will see very dynamic agricultural produce marketing committees with a whole range of problems and challenges, and a lot of reforms at work. And then you'll see the Punjab and Haryana, where outside of MSP commodities, mandis work like they work in other places. But for the MSP crops, mandis don't function like markets. They function as single buyer procurement centers, where the state is the dominant buyer. So this is some of the diversity that we actually see.
One last point on the empirical facts about mandis, and this is something I really learned by reading your work, which is that mandis are the only sort of multi-commodity, year-round sites of exchange for farmers, and they buy all kind commodities at all levels of quality. That is, regardless of what the quality level is. And that may not be true of corporate procurement, right? And it's also not true of public procurement, because public procurement is typically one or two commodities. And that, your argument is that that's a real important asset for farmers in any context.
Yeah. So I think I think if we look at the two roles that mandis perform, and I say this understanding that the actual implementation of mandis and agricultural market committees in the letter and spirit of the original laws themselves has rarely happened, right? So I say this with that caveat. But the original understanding was that these are physical markets. Indian farmers need physical spot exchanges where, in every district at least, if not in every block. And here I actually think because they are markets, you can't over determine how many you should have. So the idea that you should have a mandi every 5 kilometers or every 10 kilometers doesn't quite work out, because it depends on buyers actually coming to the mandi. Right? So the first thing that's really important is that the mandi is not the site at which the state buys. The mandi is a publicly regulated market site where multiple buyers, including the state if it wishes to buy, but mostly private buyers. It's a market where private buyers and sellers interact and conduct exchange under certain rules and modalities. So if you have a well-regulated mandi, in principle, what a mandi would do is it would give you a decent price discovery, right? Because you would have some system of price discovery, like an auction. In Hadda, you had open outcry auctions. In parts of Karnataka, you had manual tendering. Now you have electronic tendering, since they've changed their systems. So depending on those are good states to look at how tendering could work. You would have some price discovery mechanism. And like I said, then you would have weights, measures, and this thing. So what the mandi provides is two things. One, it provides the sale for multi-commodities, and qualities as well. This is important because most farmers produce multiple crops, right? Most Indian farmers, especially small and marginal farmers, produce multiple crops, and they wish to sell all of them. So if unless they're keeping some for home consumption, like we discussed. So the mandi is one place where you will have all sizes of buyers as well. You will have small buyers who may process further and sell. You may have very large multinational trading corporations there as well. So the joke used to be that mandi mein mitti ke liye bhi bhav hai, right? You have a price even for mud. Now, for processors, this is really irritating. People would say this is a problem with the mandi, that you don't have enough standardization. But for farmers, it's actually quite important because they face a huge number of production risks, because the quality of their produce is variable under varying production conditions. It's important to have sites for disposal. And one of the things you see in very strong consolidated corporatized systems is you may see more homogenization of production, but what you also see is much more rejection rates, right? Wastage, because you don't have absorptive markets that find buyers and sellers for every kind of quality that comes in. The second important public function that mandis play is that they are sites for dissemination of market intelligence. So even when corporations come into these areas and buy outside mandis, because as we should know that almost of the 28 states that have agricultural marketing laws, over 22 to 25 of them have actually already amended their laws prior to these acts to allow private corporations to operate. In the places where private corporations have come in, where mandis exist, they usually peg their prices to mandi prices, right? So that's again important, because when you have a mandi, it helps farmers know what is the market price. So even if you negotiate a sale outside of the mandi, in the village or in another market site, you have a well-discovered price, a benchmark price at which to peg and actually bargain. And it gives you a real option, right, in terms of your bargaining capacity. And then finally, on dispute resolution and counterparty risk, it's quite important. One of the things we've noticed in Madhya Pradesh over the last few months, for example, is that there have been a lot of incidents reported where farmers under the new acts have sold to a trader that showed them a PAN card and showed them, mandi license, which they had then cancelled, but then failed to make payments and paid a few farmers, got their trust, and then absconded without making the complete payment. And this act doesn't have a system for, counterparty risk. So you have no mechanism, whereas the Mandi Acts do have systems where you give a license, you have to put up, an advance, you take, some sort of collateral, so that if the trader runs away, you can actually settle the farmer's dues. Whereas under the new act, it assumes you'll only have disputes over quality or settlement or things like that. And so when the SDMs and the collectors had to kind of figure out what to do, and they relied on the Mandi Sachivs to come and help them do this, what they found was that they had to create a panel, a conciliation board with the trader and his representatives, but the trader had disappeared. So he was a Farrar trader. So they said, how would we do this with somebody who's gone away, right? So there were a lot of lessons from previous marketing experiences, particularly on counterparty risk and other things, which we could have learned to avoid these kinds of gaps, right? So if you're providing farmers well-regulated exchange, you have to make sure that you take care of some of these critical elements. And these laws, unfortunately, have no mechanism for the recording of price information. They've actually increased regulatory fragmentation because now you have APMCs, you have areas outside APMCs, different states have APMCs and areas outside APMCs. So what you've seen is actually regulatory fragmentation because they could not override state acts because agricultural marketing is a state subject. So what you've seen is greater invisibilization, you've seen greater fragmentation, and you've seen a weakening of mechanisms like, sort of dispute resolution, which are very problematic for farmers. So, that's why mandis play this kind of public good role, which I think we've misunderstood a little bit. The infrastructure is very important, but also the public regulation is very important. And one final point, that comes through very strongly from the work in Harda, for example, which is a mandi that reformed itself over years and became a better performing mandi and became a model mandi over time, is when the mandi reformed, even though it was larger farmers who led the reforms, pushed for an electronic weighbridge and really fought for changes in the mandi, because it's a public market site, all farmers benefited from the public good nature of this site, right? Whereas both for ITC's procurement center, only certain farmers were able to participate. And so while it did provide price competition for those farmers, it didn't provide price competition for all farmers. That's one important point. And secondly, even procurement is restricted, So sharecroppers really struggle to provide the documents required to do procurement and participate fully in procurement. If the title is not yours, you cannot easily, So the mandi doesn't require all of these kinds of, evidences to transact. And therefore it's a more open site currently. This doesn't mean we cannot reform other sites and a much better system. But overall, I think keeping in mind the regulatory principles when you're thinking about farmers is something we should do.
I want to turn to another part of the new set of legislations, which is contract farming. Now, in the past decade, at least from what I have read, contract farming in India is already there. It's not something that is now being introduced. It's already been happening, but to some extent, it's been focused on certain niche commodities, particularly those where there was a need for greater interaction, sort of a closer relationship between downstream actors and the farmers themselves. Now, is it likely that the new acts will sort of expand the scope of contract farming beyond where it is right now? And do you think this is important or even desired? Um,
Yeah, no, it's a great, it's a great question. I think the acts themselves and, the work of Sudha Narayanan and Sukhpal Singh and others who've really studied contract farming very, very closely. What is very clear is that, contract farming has to be a mutually beneficial arrangement. And as you say, it usually is crops and commodities that require a lot of engagement through the production system, where the contract farming, the entity, the corporate or the buyer is engaged in different parts of the cultivation process and the marketing process. So it rarely works for other commodities. This was also true, by the way, of cooperatives. And Gujarat is a very, important state for this. But, the work of Baviskar, of Atwood, and many others who studied the cooperatives in Gujarat and Maharashtra found that they worked very well for sugarcane and they worked for dairy. But the same principles did not work in the same way for cotton, did not work in the same way for groundnut, because there were social and technical reasons why, and in both of these cases, they're really agro-industrial commodities. You need a lot of processing to happen. And therefore, actually, it incentivizes collectivization and a certain kind of scaling and integration that happens, where you need collective investments in infrastructure. You need collective investments in a factory and in processing. And that actually meant that it also incentivized small and large farmers to come together in a given area, in a common site. So, this you saw very much in the case of cooperatives as well. It's a similar logic, right? It's very difficult, oil-fed, there was an oilseed cooperative that was set up in Madhya Pradesh as well. They just haven't had the kind of durability. And so we do have to understand what factors drive this, what kinds of relationships. So for example, definitely on livestock, on poultry, we're seeing this with, prawn cultivation, and again in Balasore, which we saw, that there's a lot of involvement of both the processors, the exporters, and the intermediaries with farmers in these high value cash crops, right? You don't see the same kind of thing with food grains, necessarily with millets, pulses. And what you can see is even there, a certain amount of aggregation does work and can have, at least in the short term, some benefits for farmers. But unless there is a, a need, so you may have, for example, if you have an FPO and they aggregate, their ability to build relationships with, a buyer, to actually set up that kind of relationship. But even there, they may want to decide whether it's a contract farming arrangement, whether they set up a different kind of system of procurement as well. So, I think everybody agreed from the last 20 years that what we want is to have better regulated systems, some kind of solid public investment in basic market infrastructures, and then open up the options for farmers and a range of different buyers to buy and sell. I think it's really important to remember that India's agricultural markets are overwhelmingly private markets. They depend on the exchange between small producers and a whole range of intermediaries and buyers who are also largely small scale, right? And regional capital processors. So we have, intermediaries, then you have millers and processors, you have wholesalers and retailers. And all of these are private entities. So the state really dominates a few commodities, and even within that, in a few regions. And the same goes, at the side of buyers, consumers, although about 67% of the Indian population is covered under the NFSA. And of course, rations are a vital lifeline for a large number of Indian consumers. Most of their other purchases of agricultural commodities are done in private markets, right? So I think that's really important for us to remember. And there's no real sense that legal change is going to lead to consolidation, because we've seen in a number of different states where these legal changes have been brought about already, where opening up of markets has happened, where integration of markets has happened. The fundamental challenges of production and consumption has not meant either large-scale private investments in these markets, nor have they meant much consolidation. The question is therefore, what do we do for public policy, given that these markets are livelihood centers for a vast number of people, but they're not aiding accumulation, wealth creation for a very large number of people, right? They are efficient, but so, they are markets of reproduction and not markets of accumulation for the vast majority. And that's their big problem. Whereas we're treating them like inefficient sites, whereas they are not sites of inefficiency. They are sites where there are a whole range of structural issues that need to be addressed.
So I have just one last question before, and there are so many interesting questions in the chat box that we won't get to, but just one last one, and this is about the politics of the protests, right? So now this, all of this complexity and the laws, it's not clear whether they'll have any effect at all, right? I mean, what exactly they're meant to do and will achieve is so unclear. But there is, in all of this, somewhere a suspicion that this is really about taking away the MSP, and that has really gotten a lot of farmers and farmers organizations upset. And that is at the root of the protests. Right? Do you think that this is is this a legitimate concern? And what does the government need to do to sort of shift focus to more productive areas of policy?
So, as you very rightly said, given the existing context, the fact that most states had brought around these regulations already, that again, ENAM, for example, and there's a question on it, I'll answer that more in more detail, but ENAM was already introduced without these laws being required. So it's not entirely clear what these laws will actually achieve, other than having deregulated markets, which require better, more comprehensive, more careful regulation and regulatory capacity, beyond opening them up in a deregulated fashion, which, again, we've seen that in unequal markets, in asymmetric markets, deregulation is usually re-regulation in favor of market power. It usually doesn't favor those who are weaker. So whether it's farmers or consumers, deregulated markets are unlikely to help them. Whether regulated markets solve problems is another question, which is you could have a regulated market but still not have remunerative incomes for farmers, and that's a real problem that could be there. So you asked the right question, which is what this would have done in the absence. I think what people have seen this as, and I think if you think about it, farmers are not working in a vacuum. Over the last several years, particularly since 2014, there was, the government had brought the Shanta Kumar Committee, which was to actually look at reform of the PDS and reform of the procurement system. There were already moves in place to try and reduce MSP, also that same committee had also suggested reducing coverage of the NFSA as well. And so there was a very real sense that the direction in which government wanted to move on the reform of the subsidy regime, both procurement and distribution, was about tightening and reducing the presence of the state rather than expanding it. Now, this actually happens in a contradictory mode because over the last 15 years, you've actually seen the expansion of procurement to many new states. Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Telangana, many new states are actually procuring more than they used to procure before. And certainly in central India, they are contributing a great deal to the central pool, and that's quite unprecedented. So while you've seen actually on the ground over the last 15 years, greater procurement happen, the sense has been, and the nervousness has been fiscally, that this is unsustainable, right? That if we expanded procurement, if more states got into procurement, how would we manage this? And what would be the future of that regime? And the sense that the food grain centricity on paddy and wheat has also, and quite rightly, people have noticed, has also caused a real problem in terms of agroecological consequences, and that it has really made it hard to think about diversification. So I think there was no doubt that there was a long-standing question about how should India's procurement and distribution and food security and nutrition security policy relate to the challenges of agroecology and economy, and how do we do this better? So this was a pending question. Now, what has happened with the laws is, I think the sense farmers have is that this is going to be a renegotiation of the role of the state in the market, where the state steps out with whatever limited protections it has provided and leaves farmers more and more to fend for themselves in market sites, which have not really served them particularly well. Because, like I've said, the markets are responsive, but they haven't helped farmers accumulate in many parts of the country. In some parts, depending on the crop and the crop cycle, you have seen remarkable accumulation. The story of soybean is largely a private market story, although oil-fed and Tilansang played a very important role, and there was a national mission. But it was a private market, and we saw that it worked. We are seeing similar things with other crops. So the important point here is that I think farmers perceive it, particularly farmers from the states that have benefited most from the existing system, perceive it as a withdrawal of the state and the state's support in agriculture. And this is not coming in a vacuum, as I said. They have reason to think that this may be what the government would like to do. I think what we need is much more comprehensive policy that takes a look at the challenges of parity. What will it actually take to make farm income sustainable? What kinds of public investments are really required? And then to take it from there. So that's my sense that, unless we open this space up and go back to the drawing board with much, much greater grounded understanding of what different states need, what are the transitions that different states are going through. And here it's really important because, agriculture has always been more than rural, right? So David Ludden always, points out that for the longest time in Indian history, urbanization happened within agriculture, right? So, you can't make agricultural policy without thinking about the relationship of the agrarian and the non-agrarian as well, and the relationship between and the role that towns and cities and other contexts play, but also that farmers have already been diversifying. So in India, for example, historically, we have seen over the last many years distress-driven diversification. But we have examples from South India, and we also saw in the Green Revolution period where farmers diversified on the back of surplus, right? And what you really want is to create multipliers in agriculture, because the state of agriculture is also to move out of agriculture. So we tend to have this vision of agriculture that everybody who's in agriculture will stay in agriculture. But agriculture is a place where if you do badly in agriculture, you hold on to land but move out of agriculture. When you do well in agriculture, you may still hold on to land, but you'll move out of agriculture, right? And so, in all these years of working with farmers, I've met very few farmers who are solely dependent on agricultural income. And it's usually the larger farmers, if at all, any of them are. But even larger farmers are usually quite diversified. So again, we cannot think about these policies for different states and different contexts without connecting the agrarian and the non-agrarian, without connecting the agroecological, the economic, and the nutritional needs of a population, which is still, like where we started the conversation, defined by a very vast number of poor producers and a very, very large number of poor consumers. So that still remains our reality.
So now I think we should turn to the audience for questions.
Yes.
Sonal had, so Sudeep, do you want to moderate the questions? Or?
Yeah, you can also begin. You can take the
So I think Sonal had a very important question. Sonal, would you like to speak out your question? Professor Sonal Yadav?
Yeah, yeah, hello. Sorry, yeah, now I can speak. Okay, very insightful talk, Mekhala. So I have a very, small question. Partially already you have answered that. So it is observed that very few farmers, about 6% have gained from MSP since 1965. Punjab and Haryana farmers produce mainly wheat and rice, and we know that it is because they get free electricity and water, and in short, huge subsidy on electricity and water. So from the point of view of sustainable farming, Do you think that it's time to diversify the cropping pattern or infuse more competition in the system? And of course, you said that yes, it is required. So I have a farmer friend, and while talking to him, he said that Sonal, it's very difficult to enter into APMC without arhatya, or through agent only you can enter. So in that way, also lots of share goes to agent also, and therefore it's good, like if we get rid of this.
No, thanks so much for the question. So first on the MSP, yes, I mean, certainly I think we need to diversify, both in terms of agroecologically, the crops that we grow, but also possibly the nutritional basket, right? So, I mean, the National Food Security Act, it's very, very focused on rice and wheat. A state like Odisha is now trying to introduce millets in its ICDS and its midday meal scheme. And, there's all this effort to actually diversify what our food basket also, right? Even the food security schemes can hold. And I think that's an important direction in which for us to also think. So you can diversify what you grow and support with MSP, but you need a system of distribution, and you can do that. And Kerala is exploring doing that even for fresh produce. There have been various experiments that at the decentralized level, you can actually improve the quality of nutrition that is provided at subsidized rates, even to consumers, right? So that there is that possibility of having a much more creative approach where states can decide what are the priorities, how does it actually help in terms of the transitional process, etc. One of the interesting things about procurement is that, from 1998, the government created something called the Decentralized Procurement Scheme, which allowed state governments to procure and to actually increase their procurement. And it was meant for non-traditional states. But until 2005, virtually hardly any states took it up. Then Odisha started taking it up. And from 2007-8, you saw Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh take it up in a big way. And like I said, Telangana and some of the other states have also, taken up decentralized procurement. Right. But it's amazing how few states have taken it up. Right. And this is also about the capacity at the state level to think about these issues, to build their own systems, to create, functioning packs. Interestingly, in Punjab and Haryana, procurement happens through arthas. In Madhya Pradesh, it happens through packs, through primary agricultural cooperative societies. In Odisha, it happens through LAMPs. So if you have a strong cooperative network or a procurement network in your state, and for that state governments also need to invest, you can actually extend the benefit of MSP to farmers in your state. But this requires states also to put in their effort and actually invest in creating that system. So that is something even states haven't done nearly enough for, and that they should. So, again, like you're seeing, the innovation is coming from the states itself. NAFED has also had an experience of pulse procurement, has expanded, and there have been many ideas, even with onions, for example, that if we kept some buffer stock, then you could allow exports to continue, for example, when export prices are high, and allow farmers to benefit from that, but have local buffer stocks or some buffer stocks so that you can empty out in cities when prices are high, so consumers don't suffer. Right? So these kinds of strategies have been discussed for a long time, but it takes capacity. It takes people to sit down, to work out how it's going to happen, to figure out the institutional arrangements, the logistics, the fund flow, etc., and make it happen. So, I mean, I think that would be one very good direction in which to think about it. The reason I don't think MSP being imposed on the private sector will work, and I don't think it should be imposed. It is important for the state to offer it if it feels like that is something that will provide for certain crops and in particular regions a priority. One of the problems we have right now is that MSP is trying to solve too many problems, right? It began as an incentive price to incentivize, to give farmers an assured market so that they would grow more paddy and wheat. Right? It still functions as an incentive price, but now it is also a risk mitigation support. It's also a price stabilization support. Now, most countries would separate out these problems and figure out what is the best way to address them. Right? So if you want to address nutrition security, you don't have to hook it to procurement systems. If you want to actually address price risk, you have to think about risk mitigation strategies for which MSP may or may not be the best strategy for you to employ. When it comes to parity pricing, I think increasingly around the world, farmers are saying that, look, even when you have perfectly regulated, good regulated markets, the nature of volatility in these agricultural commodity markets means that you still may not get parity, right? And as you integrate markets more, you have more winners and losers. So one is you have to solve your risk problem simultaneously. Secondly, you have to have transitional arrangements for the losers. If they may move out of agriculture, they may do other things, they may have to be tided over for a particular season or two, and that would be important. And the third is a minimum, like a floor price parity pricing system, where if you can imagine farmers, and if they were getting a good parity price for a number of crops, they wouldn't just grow paddy and wheat.
Right.
And so actually encourage diversification by expanding parity pricing. It doesn't mean you have to have a very high price. It functions in a sense like a protection and, you know, an income support. And the idea that farmers will not move out of farming because of this, in my mind, is not credible. Because I know farmers who hold on to their land while doing many other things for income. And when I ask them why they don't give up their land, they say, well, when everything closes, we'll have our land. Right. They're using their land as insurance. Now, in that kind of context, unless the economy is generating jobs that people feel like they can depend on year on year on year, you won't see a transition, right? So I think, therefore, in that context, providing minimal parity pricing, I think, is incredibly important. On the point on Artiyas, I think it's really important to keep in mind, why do they exist, right? So in Punjab and Haryana, they are still very important creditors. They provide up to 40% of informal credit in these markets. So if you want to replace them, you have to think about the credit function in those markets. In other markets, like I said, they are not creditors between farmers and buyers, but they are creditors to the onward buyer. So there again, it's quite hard to replace them, but you can ensure that they don't exploit farmers by introducing better regulation, but they will still be important to keep the market moving. You know, and so I think the important role when it comes to commission agents, artyas, different kinds of middlemen, is to ask what is the role that they're playing, what is the right price for that role, and how do you create a regulatory system that puts checks and balances on exploitation there. If you wish to replace that, I'm back.
Thank you very much for your response. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks.
We have two more questions. One from Gmol and another from Amol that I thought was very apt for the speaker who we have with us today. So maybe because we are running out of time, if Gmol and Amol can go one after another, then we can get two questions in a row.
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Mekhala. That was a fascinating talk, and I think you covered most of what all of us would like to hear. So just to ask a question, one of the, the fears of these farm laws is this whole bogey of corporate takeover, both in terms of production and in terms of marketing on both sides. So, do you have any idea as to what proportion of the marketed surplus in different crops is actually taken by the corporates? Because obviously they are very crop specific. They're not interested in all crops. And if this kind of a system comes in where the APMC is weakened in this fashion, to what extent will that corporate market surplus proportion increase? I mean, is it going to become like 50% being taken over by the corporates or something like that? In which case, the small farmer might be a loser in that game. And also, will that actually, because ultimately the corporates need an aggregator. They're not going to go farm to farm and collect. We all know that. So would that increase the role? Of course, you've told us diverse ways in which marketing is happening, but would that increase the role of the middlemen, which is what you're trying to, get rid of in some sense? And of course, ENAM is something that has already been there in the question thing. Is that really working? Because about 5 years ago, we were all very enthusiastic about ENAM, and then, there were all these It's mostly only corporates, people who can register and so on can really handle that enough. And the last thing is, what do you think about the farmer producer organizations? Because from what I've understood, a lot of them are like marketing fronts of the corporates. So how does this work out?
Great. Karthik, that's so many questions. Shall I quickly try and answer them?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Jumala. You know, it's so I think we don't have good enough data to fully explain how much is the corporate share. And at the final end, right? So for example, but we can estimate. So when it comes to fresh food and, you know, markets like vegetables and fruit markets, the more everyday vegetables and fruit, it's not a very large number. People say at the outer end, it may be 10 to 15% of retail is actually organized corporate retail. It's still, after all these years, and now FDI in retail has been allowed, etc. The vast majority of Indians are still buying actually in small shops, in informal channels. Corporate retail is not the predominant channel so far, right? So that's in the case of fresh produce. And this is very true because Indians don't eat a lot of processed food. So the estimates again on processing is around 8% to 10% at aggregate, which is very small. And if you look at very large corporatized agri-systems, there's a very, very high incidence of processed food. So if you look at commodities which are processed, like for example, maize goes into corn, so into feed processing, or oil seeds, right? Where you look at soya bean, almost all of it, I would say the vast majority end up in corporate processing, because oil seeds have to have quite a lot of investment, right? Same with sugarcane, although you will have some small scale sugar production, gourd, etc., produced in the village, you will have a lot of it going to factories, you know, and sugarcane will get produced. Oil seeds, you will see a lot of consolidation, right? Because you need refineries. And of course, we still have some traditional methods of oilseed production. In fact, we found in some places, mustard, for example, was definitely grown for home consumption in a number of places that we've done work in Bihar and Odisha. But, you know, soya bean, for example, groundnut, or mustard will otherwise in other places go to corporations and to, you know, different kinds. Again, with potatoes, we know that certain kinds of potatoes that go into chips. Durum varieties of wheat will go into pasta and, you know, will go more into processing. So we can do this exercise. It's an important exercise to be done. A lot of the corporates do it and marketing agencies do it to estimate how much will go in. But really things that go into feed, that go into processing, those are the ones that have the overwhelming share and that are well traded. So again, you'll see that happen with, you know, soybean was highly traded abroad. So again, you know, larger trading companies will come in those areas. But, you know, the real puzzle, like, so when I was doing this research over the years, I talked to a lot of the corporates, and one of them, large multinational corporation, said to me, you know, Mekhala, the problem in India is that there are not enough barriers to entry. Didn't say there are too many barriers to entry, said there are not enough barriers to entry. Because from colonial times, large corporations who have all existed in Indian markets for a very long time, Louis Dreyfus and, you know, others are there from 1920s, Sargoda Mandi, you know, Prakash Tandon's description of Sargoda Mandi in Punjab talks about all these, you know, foreign traders coming and buying even then. They have all struggled with the problem of channel command. And channel command means not just controlling the middle part of the chain, but inputs, outputs, finance, you know, logistics, warehousing, credit, all of these elements, right? And this is what they do in very, very consolidated markets. So that is incredibly hard to do in the Indian market in the current context. The reason for that is because we have so much regulatory fragmentation, we have so much random, participation of the state in various different places, but also because small actors keep entering and exiting these markets on a regular basis. Regional processors also exist, wholesale traders also exist, brokers also exist, they all keep coming and going. And just as you said, what we saw in Bihar was a proliferation of brokerage with the removal of APMCs and the re-regulation. You saw more brokers coming because as demand grew, more people from outside started coming. People needed more trust relations to be managed. More local brokers proliferated as well. So you actually see sometimes an increase in brokerage in some of these markets. The trick is that these markets, therefore, accommodate many people, but they don't actually allow many people to become wealthy, right? Or to accumulate. Now, that's a big problem when you think about Indian, from the point of farm incomes, right? You want to remove these middlemen. But when you think about it from the point of a local economy, many of these people are also surviving on agricultural markets for their incomes and for reproduction. So if you were to remove these and actually aggregate and remove people out of this system, the other question you have to ask is, where will you replace them? Where will they go? Right? So one of the flip sides of aggregation and FPOs is, what do you do about all those people who were actually involved in these markets? And the other thing that you find is, even for FPOs, getting into these markets is quite complicated because the intermediaries manage labor. They manage the cleaning, sorting, grading, transport, warehousing. So what has happened to FPOs is, by the time they pay for additional staff to do all of this, the margins have pretty much disappeared. So many of them have become aggregators, but they're not able to take the next step into the value chain, which would allow them to do that. But in order to do that, they have to build competencies in all of these areas. Otherwise, they basically end up playing an aggregator's game. And once they play an aggregator's game, they tend to mimic traders and speculate on commodities. So they wait, but they often do that without having good hedging mechanisms. Then if the price crashes, they actually collapse. Now they've taken money from their members. So it can actually go into a vicious cycle where you're not doing particularly responsible kind of trading practices because you don't have all the risk mitigation mechanisms that informal traders have. And their mechanisms are not formal. Their mechanisms are completely informal diversification that is often driven by distress and nothing else, or by sort of, being semi-visible in this system. So these are all the challenges of kind of thinking through how this actually works itself out.
Thanks, Mekhala.
We have a question from Aditya on ENA, which has come up already once or twice before, but it's important enough that I thought I'll flag it again. And one question from Amol.
Yeah, I can take Amol's question and then I can answer ENA. Yeah.
Just wanted to point out that we are out of time, but we'd like to request you to
fine.
for another 5-10 minutes.
No, it's perfectly fine. If people would stick around, that's great.
I think people are all watching and they really want to continue.
Yeah. So hi, Mekhala. This is just fabulous stuff. Really interesting to hear your views as an anthropologist on farm talks. And as somebody who works in the economics area, I'm perhaps digging my own grave by asking this question. But I should, in these discussions such as agri and farm laws, we usually reach out to the economist for the views and things. But in these things, really hearing other professions like anthropologists, sociologists, and it is really very interesting the kind of names you brought into this discussion today. Barbara Harris-White and Professor Srinivas and so on and so forth. These are all names most economists hardly really read and understand, and they obviously have wider lessons in terms of how things have shaped up and stuff like that. So this is a general question. I mean, that how can we really broaden this discussion from just an economist's lens to a wider anthropology, other professions coming in. So any thoughts on this? how can we go about doing this? Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I'll take this one and then leap back into Enam. But it's so important that I think we have some answers to this. I'm sure Jimol and others will agree with Indian political economy itself. So the agrarian debates and discussions that happened in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, definitely at places like CDS and other places. Kian Raj and the work that they did on commercialization. So one of the big challenges, right? And like anthropologists have also contributed to this problem. So if you think about the old Jajmani grain heap, I wrote this paper called Reconceiving the Grain Heap, not misconceiving it. The old Jajmani grain heap assumed the market was some alien imposition, and that village exchange was somehow hierarchical, organized within the village, caste-based alone, right? And Chris Fuller, a very important anthropologist, pointed out that we just missed the market all around us. And we created this anthropological fiction that the market was some lurking external entity, whereas most farmers had already been partially commercialized, had been dealing in cash for some years, had been paying parts of their revenue to the state in cash. Taxation had already happened, of course, for many years because agriculture was a source of taxation. So, these markets or these economies have been partially commercialized for a very long time. And historians have brought this out for us over years of scholarship. Anthropologists had a tendency to focus on the village and not see the market as part of these social relations. Economists, of course, focus much more on abstraction. And one of the things I say about Enam is, but the political economists didn't. Right? So that generation of political economists in the 70s, 80s were not looking at abstraction. Even Barbara's tradition of field economics, of actually going to the ground and actually figuring out empirically. One of the joys of the recent research that I've done with both Soumitra Chatterjee, who's an economist, Devesh Kapoor, who's a political scientist, is that we all cite each other's data much more than we cite our own. Right? So Soumitra will often talk about the ethnography, and I will be citing the farm survey that we did. And looking at margins, because we are deeply committed to generating illuminating insight about these economies. And I'm often asked, so do you work on the social life of markets? And I'm like, no, I work on markets. Do you work on like the cultural aspects of price? I'm like, no, I work on price making and how prices actually come to be made. And as an anthropologist, I can illuminate aspects of that. Economists illuminate other aspects of that. When we put it together, we really start to see what a system looks like and are able to, identify these, relationships much more clearly. And then also to think about the options. So I feel, in some senses, I've been very lucky because I've been taken seriously throughout my work by economists, whether it was Barbara or people here, all my colleagues here or, scholars. And so one of the things I'm really excited about is participating in the annual meeting of the Indian Society of Agricultural Economists later this year, because I think that's exciting, like to be able to contribute to that conversation. I do think we used to do this before, and I actually think universities like Ahmedabad and Ashoka, we need to be thinking about how we create spaces where we can genuinely have these conversations, where even our founding assumptions can be challenged, and we can move forward from that. But I always joke that the anthropologists missed the market because the market was too abstract. We thought it was an abstract thing without realizing that the market is grounded in social relations. Enam misses the heap because it considers the heap far too embedded in local life, right? And markets happen because there are heaps created. And these are physical, logistical markets. So I have a lot of conversations with people saying, things are now, farmers are trading on Enam. So I said, yeah, but the commodity doesn't move on optic cables. It is still a physical commodity that needs to be stored and traded and transferred and bagged and then moved and distributed. So these are physical markets, but markets as a whole are always both embedded and abstract, right? Like the traders are incredibly good about thinking about abstraction. And one of the nice things that anthropology has done over the last decade, I think, is really thinking about the material life of abstraction, right? How do we get to models? How do we get to concepts? How do we begin to think this is how an exchange should look? How do we come to actually make sense of what a regulatory regime should look like, right? Law and legal thinking has a material life, market systems have material lives. So I think this relationship between materiality and abstraction is what makes markets work. They're always both. And I think that's why economists and anthropologists can have incredibly productive conversations. If we paid more attention just to the empirical, context, and I think this is where political economy can really come to the rescue, I think, in the imagination as well, right? So I think that's one thing. On ENAM, let me, and Jimal also made this point. So ENAM was created, I sometimes say about ENAM, it's an app without a platform. They meant the Mandi is supposed to be the platform of ENAM, right? So actually to make ENAM work, what could have been really useful is to start with physical markets and to see how does produce actually move. And then see what would be the sites at which you could integrate some kind of electronic trading platform, right? Is the Mandi the best site at which to do that in every state? If some states don't have mandis, where will you do it? So for example, ENAM has completely bypassed Bihar because Bihar doesn't have mandis. In some places like in Odisha, the two ENAM mandis that we saw, all the trade happened outside. Nobody, they've actually even created physical infrastructure, but nobody actually spends, the sampling lab is used basically to make khichdi and tea for the mandi staff, but nobody actually comes and trades in it. In other states, what has actually happened is, manual transactions are just entered onto ENAM. And in some states, they use ENAM for a single commodity for a certain window of time, and then they go back to manual trading as well. So if you see what happened in Karnataka, it was very interesting. They actually systematically brought mandis which were doing manual tendering onto electronic tendering. It took quite a while to go mandi by mandi to get them online. In places where the mandi is not the primary site of trade, it might be interesting to see who would you link up to this, right? A big problem that's happening with ENAM is sampling. You need intermediaries to be able to do sampling, to do quality assurance, to actually take delivery and then to do the next stages. That element wasn't fixed and worked out. So what you start seeing is some electronic bidding. You see very little buying outside of the same mandi. So, you don't see inter-mandi buying, and you see almost negligible intrastate buying, which was the original promise, that somebody sitting in another state without actually having to be physically present could bid. But for that, you need a lot of standardization, quality assurance, and logistics support, which you haven't worked out. So, for ENAM to work, so we talk about Amazon and we talk about these big, retail giants and e-commerce, but it's got a huge backend and a very well worked out backend. In India, this backend is what I just showed you. These completely complex commodity chains are the backend, right? So you have to start backend first. If you wanted to build up and improve the terms of engagement of farmers in these markets, and of buyers in these markets, and of consumers in these markets, you have to first understand how it operates and then move towards thinking about what kind of consolidation. And that's another place where I think these acts have really missed an opportunity. They could have created, for example, an interstate council, which brought all the states in, rather than a plug and play approach where you just, bring in an electronic platform. You needed states to buy into a common market. Right? If what you're trying to build is a national market, and remember, we already have a physical national market because most of the commodities that you are eating or that you will see in your fridges don't come from nearby. So they have moved and found their way to you. We have a vast physical national market. But if you wanted to make this more of a common market, you would need different states to come on board. They would have losses in certain areas. You would negotiate those losses. This is what the EU did. For each and everything, they actually came in. And a lot of people get upset and they say, but that's a continent and we are one country, we can't do it. But in federal arrangements where states are at very different levels, you will have to have some negotiation, right? And that negotiation is important. And so we could have created an interstate council for agriculture. We could have actually looked at the role of the states. And I still hope that that's the direction we'll go in, because unless we actually think about a better institutional architecture for moving towards these kinds of questions, we won't really, break ground. And like I said, if you integrate more, you should be ready for more risk. You should be ready for more volatility. You know this better than me. It's the economists will tell you integration brings winners and losers. Integration brings greater volatility. So if you're not going to be ready with better, mechanisms for risk mitigation, you're going to have more trauma in the market, which you don't want. So I think there are principles that we could follow. There are institutional structures and arrangements we could build. It will take a lot of state capacity, a lot of actual commitment. But for ENAM to work, it needs to flip itself from dashboard to drawing board and go back end first and actually start focusing on how the markets look. And then actually, I think, farmers are very adaptive, traders are very adaptive. They all look at their mobile phones. We saw a huge change in price asymmetry when mobile phones came in. Every single trader I know looks at the dabba, the futures market, before trading on soybean or buying. So people are very adaptive, and we saw a huge change in asymmetry from phones to mobile phones penetration. So I don't see a problem with using technology. It's about making it relevant. I heard somebody else say that agri-tech in India is a lot of solutions in search of problems. The problems are quite obvious if you go to the ground, and then we can build up to the solutions.
The last question that I'd like to invite is from Professor Samir, who had a question in the chat box on sustainability of agriculture. I'll just read out the question. So he says,
am I unmuted now? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So this was an excellent discussion. Thank you very much. So I teach a course on sustainability and society at the university. So, I think one of the questions, a lot of the debate has featured around state laws and etc. But I recently read a piece by Partho Dasgupta, on biodiversity. And the discussion internationally, since I work with a couple of people over there in terms of global agricultural stuff, is on regenerative agriculture. How do you protect the top 18 to 24 inches of soil, which actually drives a lot of the productivity? And I think we take a look at and say that, look, we are the largest drawer of groundwater, as if it's like a commodity. And when I read statistics like globally, it takes 2,200 liters to produce 1 kg of rice. And in Punjab, it is 2,800 liters, because solar pumps are free, electricity is free, and water is free. So farmers actually, in anything that is given free is misused actually. So these things are not addressed, and we are while the discussion on MSP is clearly a very relevant one, but core sustainability issues. And then, I mentioned in my note that, we do sugarcane farming in the most drought-prone areas of Maharashtra, and these practices continue because of political issues for years. So I think what I'm saying is there are core problems that perhaps need to be at least discussed. And I think right now the debate is only on MSP and whether the farmers' agitation should stop. Whereas these core issues where the discussion globally is we need to change our production and consumption patterns in agriculture. Instead of that, we are focusing on what is state versus center political debate on MSP, which clearly misses the point in terms of how we're going to look at this in the next 10 years.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your question. One way to think about it, we grow paddy in Punjab, which also shouldn't happen.
Yeah, exactly.
But one way to think about it is I think we are not taking the right lessons from the Green Revolution. The wrong lessons are the ones we've all got hold of, agroecological mismanagement, a subsidy regime which is not sustainable for anybody and actually drives this kind of agroecological degradation, and also a food security system that has become completely shifted towards food grain consumption, when we should actually be thinking about proteins and much more diversified sources of nutrition as well. So, I think the right lesson from the Green Revolution was public investment. It was that any major shift in agriculture doesn't happen through laws. Right? The MSP itself has never required a law. The Green Revolution did not require a law. It happens through catalytic, well-directed public investments. And what brought change in the Green Revolution was a huge investment in agricultural science. Again, we know it may have been the wrong kind of science. We've learned a lot about it in terms of now thinking about diversification very differently and understanding soils differently and understanding production systems differently and understanding markets and consumption differently too. But we did build up a large public extension system. We built up a network of public agricultural universities and agricultural institutions. We built up institutions, whether they were procurement centers or mandis and other kinds of infrastructures. We invested in irrigation and a whole range of other management. We've stopped doing that. Right. So if you look at investment in agriculture, it's gone down now to, estimated to about 15% or so of overall investment in agriculture comes from the state. Overwhelming investment in agriculture, 82% or more, is, estimated to come from farm households.
Yes.
And about 3 to 4% comes from corporations. So let's be very clear when we're hoping that they will come and transform this landscape. It's not going to happen. Indians are not actually wealthy enough, nor consuming wealthy enough food, processed enough food for corporations to want to come into this sector. It is going to depend on the state, not taking a role where they thinks about the state versus the market, but thinks about public value and shared interests rather than contested interests. Right. And for that, I don't think we can do it without a fair degree of decentralization. 2 weeks ago, I was in Meghalaya, where they have a challenge of areca nut plantations, right? And there's a problem there with forest cover. It's an increasingly grown cash crop. That's a very specific context in which we think about what they should be growing and consuming. Kerala has a very different dynamic. I mean, state by state and even within state, agroecological diversity is quite remarkable. So unless we build up actually some capacities to do, and it sounds like a terrible word and so infra-dig, but planning, like some amount of actually planning, investment. And therefore, I mean, I've been thinking that what we need is a framework for public investment and regulation.
Yes.
Right? Where it's not driven by regulation, it's driven by the conditions of production and consumption. And it's driven in a forward-thinking way about the kinds of transitions that we need to make in both. And so I think those are the kinds of things, and they will have to be politically negotiated. It is a democracy. It is a federal system, and we will have to, and it's tedious and painful. But the one thing that Harda Mandi did teach me was that it's also possible. And, the kinds of changes in that one mandi, from a place where a 3-acre yard, where there was no irrigation, where farmers were terrified to enter the mandi yard, to one where they actually participating and engaging. And, of course, Gujarat is another place where we've seen these transformations. So I think unless we do that, and that's also why I wanted to say that in that system, we also have to think about the non-agricultural transitions. Because, for example, the South has shown us a number of places where agricultural surplus has driven rural industrialization. Rural industrialization, for example, Tirupur. Now, Tirupur is a huge, example where Gounder agrarian toil leads to a textile cluster. But textile clusters have other water problems, and they raise other challenges for water and its management. So we actually need to think about this in a much more, comprehensive way. But to me, this is the direction in which it has to go.
Sure, fair enough. No, point well taken. The only comment I was making and wanted to just end with, because this is a longer conversation in any case, was that mandi and the price determination is a small subset of the problems that face the agricultural system. And I just find that the others are not even debated in the public domain as to why are we using so much water? Why don't we have drip irrigation? Why do we do sugarcane in Mara? I mean, what I'm saying is that and you're right that, look, different states will have different issues to be dealt with. So also, which is why perhaps it is decentralized, because the one shoe fits all concept also does not work actually.
And this is where farmers are extremely important to talk to, not just in consultations, but they live with the realities of agricultural degradation, agroecological cost, and financial cost as well, inputs and other things. So, they're very clear about what has happened, but it's a very tough to ask them to make changes, in the public interest, when there isn't a system that is helping facilitate those transitions. Which is why I think the farmers in Punjab are telling you, when you needed food security, you turned to us. Now we are a problem for you, and you want to withdraw. But it's, this problem was created by the state and center in a certain way, and farmers' participation at that time, you got what you needed. So I think we do have to go back to this thing and, build these. But I've seen a huge amount of adaptation.
Absolutely. So, one last point I would make is that the world's largest natural farming is happening in the state of Andhra Pradesh. I'm involved with that because I work with UNEP quite closely actually. And that doesn't get publicized outside of Andhra Pradesh at all. When globally, we're talking about this at the UN forums, but in India, I mean, that level of conversation to say, look, how are you restoring soil health?
Correct.
And the conversation has to go beyond yield per acre to how you restore soil health for the foreseeable future, for the longer term. But the fact that globally the largest natural farming project is happening in a state in the south is least publicized, and we should perhaps be doing more about it together as well.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more that there's lots to learn from the states. And I think actually all major innovations that have happened, including the good and the ones we've taken on, like INAM and other things, have all come from the states trying to do various things. And I think if we turn it around and the center becomes a facilitator of these changes, we can see.
I won't take more of your time, but thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So on that note, I think the last point is really the main lesson that we should be learning, that India is a very diverse country, and that there's no one size fits all solution. And on that note, I really want to thank Mekhala for spending 2 hours with us and illuminating the contours of this very complex system for this audience. And I want to hand it over to Sudhir for final words.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mekhala.
Thank you so much, everyone. And one word that comes to my mind is we are truly grateful to you, to both of you, for asking and answering and discussing so much on this issue. I think this issue needed 2 hours. Otherwise, generally we finish by 1.5 hours and we go mostly 10 more minutes. But this needed, and thank you so much for this.
Usually around this time, traders in Harda would say, "Mekhla ko ek pan khila do, fir wo thoda time ke liye chup rahegi." So, like at least till I struggle on that. But, it's been such a pleasure. I think we don't make enough time to have these conversations, get into these details, and really think, imaginatively and empirically about agriculture. And it's been just wonderful to have a chance to interact with all of you. Karthik, thanks so much for those questions. And to all of you for persisting and staying through a Saturday afternoon to have this discussion.
Thank you so much, everyone, and thanks to